It was the sort of afternoon that seemed to belong entirely to an English summer. The lawns of the vicarage stretched out in gentle slopes, the roses blazed crimson against the brick walls, and the air was sweet with lavender drifting in from the borders. Mrs. Clement, bustling here and there in her wide straw hat, had arranged the garden party with all the energy of a general commanding troops. There were trestle tables draped in lace cloths, plates stacked high with sandwiches, and a particularly fine Victoria sponge that everyone said must have come from her own oven, though in truth it was the contribution of the obliging village baker. The purpose of the gathering was, officially, to raise money for the church roof fund, which had developed a most uncooperative leak. But in practice it was a social occasion, and half the village had turned out to sip tea, nibble cakes, and exchange the latest morsels of gossip. The air was filled with the polite hum of conversation, punctuated by the occasional laughter, that rose too high and too sharp to be entirely genuine. Miss Jane Marple sat a little apart beneath the shade of a pear tree, her hands moving steadily, over a pair of knitting needles. To the casual eye she might have looked absorbed only in her wool, but her pale eyes missed nothing. She observed the tilt of a hat, the press of lips, the small frown that betrayed irritation, the laugh that was a fraction too eager. It was all to her as revealing as the pattern of stitches in her knitting. The figure at the centre of attention was, of course, Mrs. Euphemia Blackwell, though no one in St. Mary Mead ever spoke her name without adding in lowered tones, the widow. Euphemia had been widowed not once, not twice, but 6 times, and the village, being what it was, could not possibly refrain from keeping count. She had buried 6 husbands with admirable composure, and now, at the age of 55, she was on the brink of marrying a 7th. She made a striking figure that afternoon in lilac silk, a colour she always insisted was appropriate for one who has known grief yet retains hope. A large feathered hat shaded her plump rouged cheeks. She was laughing now, loudly and a little too freely, as Mrs. Clement steered her toward the largest group of guests. "My dear Mrs. Blackwell," Mrs. Clement said in a voice meant to carry, "you will soon have more experience of marriage than the rest of us combined." "What an example you set!" There was a ripple of laughter. Some faces smiled politely, others exchanged quick sidelong glances. Miss Marple, quietly clicking her needles, permitted herself the faintest of smiles. She had lived long enough to know that admiration was often edged with malice, and no woman with 6 dead husbands could expect to escape that particular truth. Euphemia, however, basked in the attention. "Yes, indeed," she said with a flutter of her handkerchief. "It is not every woman who has known both the joys and sorrows of matrimony quite so fully. But I am confident this time, oh yes. Harold is a dear soul, and he appreciates the domestic arts." "Domestic arts?" asked Mrs. Price Ridley with her usual tartness. "Why, cooking, of course," Euphemia declared with a smile that was meant to be charming, but came across as self-satisfied. "A man may be lured by a pretty face, but it is a proper supper that wins his heart. My dear Harold says he adores my roast. For our wedding supper, I shall cook it myself." There were polite exclamations of admiration, though behind them lurked something else, something between unease and dark amusement. After all, several of Euphemia's former husbands had been known to praise her cooking too, right up until the day of their unexpected deaths. Miss Marple's eyes remained lowered, but her mind lingered on the remark. A widow, with 6 graves. Behind her, who insisted on cooking her own wedding supper, was, in its way, a curious boast. Human nature, she thought, was a most peculiar thing. The church bell tolled 5, and the company began to drift toward the tables once more. It was then that the spell of peaceful routine broke. A young footman, pale and breathless, hurried across the lawn. His livery was slightly disheveled, his hair damp with sweat, and when he reached Euphemia, he bent close and whispered something into her ear. The effect was immediate. Euphemia gave a great, shuddering gasp, her hand flying to her chest. Her feathered hat tilted precariously as she swayed. Then, in a voice shrill enough to carry across the lawn, she cried, "Harold is dead!" The words fell like a stone into a still pond. Conversations ceased. Cups rattled upon saucers. Somewhere in the branches above, a pigeon startled into flight, with a clatter of wings. "Dead?" exclaimed Mrs. Clement, turning quite pale. "But, good heavens, when?" "In the library," the footman stammered. "So not half an hour ago. Mr. Harold Blackwell, he was found collapsed by the fire." The guests erupted into anxious chatter. Some declared it must be a seizure, others spoke of weak hearts, still others muttered darkly of poison. Mrs. Price Ridley was first to lean toward her neighbour and whisper, not nearly softly enough, "7 husbands, one must begin to wonder." Euphemia burst into theatrical sobs, burying her face in her handkerchief. Her plump shoulders shook with apparent grief, though Miss Marple, watching closely, observed that her eyes remained dry. It was grief performed rather than felt, a tableau. Rehearsed too many times before, the gathering broke into disarray. Mrs. Clement hurried to comfort Euphemia, while Inspector Craddock, summoned hastily from Much Benham, was expected to arrive within the hour. Meanwhile, gossip spread as swiftly as a summer storm. Miss Marple rose slowly, folding her knitting with care. Her expression was mild, almost serene, yet her eyes glittered with that quiet intelligence which so many underestimated. She had seen such scenes before: grief that rang false, tragedies that unfolded with too much convenience, and villagers too eager to speculate, while the truth lay quietly waiting to be noticed. She paused to look at Euphemia Blackwell, now surrounded by sympathetic hands, and murmured reassurances. There was something about the widow's collapse, something about the way she had declared Harold's death, that spoke not of shock but of readiness. Miss Marple resumed her calm step across the lawn, as though she were thinking of nothing more than the roses. But in her mind, the pattern of the day was already beginning to arrange itself into something darker, for even in the most peaceful villages, murder has a way of walking hand in hand with tea and roses. The news of Harold Blackwell's sudden death spread through St. Mary Mead with a speed that rivaled the postman's morning round. By the time the church bell tolled 9 the next day, scarcely a soul in the village remained ignorant of it, though the facts had become tangled in 100 imaginative retellings. Some said he had been discovered slumped over a decanter of port, others insisted he had choked upon a fishbone, and still others declared it had been a seizure brought on by the strain of Euphemia's tempestuous affections. At the post office, Miss Hartnell was the first to deliver her verdict, which she did in a voice that suggested she had already solved the matter to her own satisfaction. Poison, of course. Sherry, if you ask me. Mark my words, that woman's been slipping things into men's glasses for years. 6 graves cannot all be accidents, and now the poor man has joined them. A pity the inspector doesn't listen to those of us who know her. Companion Mrs. Price Ridley pursed her lips. I dare say his heart simply gave out. He was a nervous sort of man, always fiddling with his cufflinks. I told my niece only last week he looked the type to keel over in the middle of a dance. The excitement of marrying Euphemia must have been too much for him, though, she added with relish, I shouldn't wonder if she gave him a push. Meanwhile, young Mr. Davies, the grocer's assistant, was heard confiding to Miss Emily Barton that Harold had likely discovered something dreadful in Euphemia's will. He probably read it and died of shock, miss, he said with a grin, enjoying the shiver his words produced. Everyone knows she's clever with her papers. Never a widow more prosperous, I'll wager. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement attempted a more charitable tone as she poured tea for Miss Marple. We mustn't judge too harshly, she said, earnestly. Euphemia has simply been most unfortunate in her husbands. A dreadful string of coincidences, of course, but coincidences do happen, and it isn't fair to imply guilt without evidence. Miss Marple, seated primly with her knitting folded neatly upon her lap, nodded with gentle agreement. Indeed, my dear, but one must observe that coincidences, when repeated often enough, are sometimes only another name for design. Mrs. Clement looked startled, then frowned as though unsure whether Miss Marple spoke in jest, but Jane Marple's face remained serenely bland, her pale eyes lowered to her teacup. Inspector Craddock arrived from Much Benham later that morning. A capable man, though occasionally impatient with what he termed village chatter, he wasted little time in visiting the Blackwell residence. To the assembled crowd of onlookers, at the gate he remarked briskly, most likely a weak heart, natural causes pending further examination, still given Mrs. Blackwell's history, we must not discount other possibilities. The crowd, far from reassured, leaned eagerly toward the darker possibility. After all, what was the use of a death in St. Mary Mead if it could not provide a week's worth of delicious speculation? Inside the Blackwell house, Euphemia played the tragic role to perfection. She reclined upon a chaise longue in the drawing-room, clad in lavender silk, her eyes rimmed with dramatic shadows of kohl. A faint scent of violets clung to her, mingling oddly with the mustiness of drawn curtains. She wept copiously when Inspector Craddock spoke of Harold, though Miss Marple, who had been invited by Mrs. Clement under the guise of offering comfort, noticed that not a single tear had fallen upon the lace handkerchief she clutched. "I am cursed," Euphemia declared in trembling tones, "cursed to bury every man who loves me. 6 dear departed souls already, and now Harold, sweet Harold, snatched from me before the vows were spoken. Oh, what a cruel jest of fate!" Inspector Craddock, whose sympathy did not extend to melodrama, coughed into his hand. "Yes, well, we'll need to speak to those who were present yesterday and to the household staff. Routine, you understand." Euphemia pressed the back of her hand to her forehead in a gesture worthy of the stage. "I shall do all that is required, but I warn you, Inspector, you will find nothing amiss. Death stalks me as faithfully as a suitor. I am doomed." Miss Marple, who had been quietly admiring a china shepherdess on the mantel, spoke in her mildest voice. "It is remarkable, Mrs. Blackwell, how often life arranges itself according to character. I recall a case in the village of Littlehampton where a lady had a habit of attracting burglars to every house she occupied. Some said it was misfortune, but others observed that she left her windows unlatched. A most curious coincidence." Euphemia's hand trembled ever so slightly before she recovered her composure. "So you are too shrewd, Miss Marple, always with your little stories. But I assure you my windows are quite fastened." By afternoon, the village had settled into its customary rhythm of gossip, each conversation shaping the story to its own design. At the inn, Mr. Archer swore he had seen Harold only 2 days before, looking pale as a sheet and muttering that he feared something dreadful. At the milliner's, Miss Hartnell confided that Euphemia had purchased a new hat in mourning black only a fortnight ago, a sure sign she expected tragedy. Miss Marple, walking slowly back to her neat little cottage on the edge of the village, absorbed these tales with her usual patience. She knew better than to dismiss gossip entirely. Like the pattern in her knitting, it often contained threads of truth woven among the tangles. What interested her most, however, was not what people said, but how they said it. The eagerness to condemn, the relish in suspicion, the almost relieved laughter that accompanied each new rumor. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was an open book for those who cared to read it. And Euphemia Blackwell's book had far too many chapters of sudden bereavement to be closed without scrutiny. That evening, as the sun set over the hedgerows and the village prepared for its suppers, Miss Marple sat quietly by her hearth. Her knitting needles clicked steadily, but her thoughts moved far more swiftly than her wool. She considered Harold's glass of sherry, the dramatic timing of Euphemia's announcement, and the curious fact that Euphemia had spoken with such eagerness of cooking her own wedding supper. It was all, she thought, a trifle too well arranged, like a stage play in which the actors had rehearsed their parts too many times, and Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that when life began to resemble theatre, murder was seldom far behind. Inspector Craddock began his inquiries the next morning, arriving at the Blackwell residence with the brisk air of a man who believed in clear questions and straightforward answers. The house was draped in mourning already, with velvet curtains drawn and a silence that was too deliberate to be natural. Euphemia Blackwell received him in black silk, a widow's veil pulled dramatically across her face, her fingers flashing, with rings that caught the light like trophies. She greeted him as though he had come to console her rather than interrogate her, her voice full of trembling notes that seemed rehearsed. She spoke at length about fate, about the cruelty of losing yet another husband, and about how she must be cursed. When asked about the evening itself, she said Harold had appeared nervous, hardly touching the venison pie she had cooked with her own hands. He had lifted his glass of sherry to her, uttered some words she claimed not to recall, and then collapsed, gone in an instant. Her performance of grief was impeccable, but it was grief for her own misfortune, not for the man who lay dead. Miss Marple, invited under the guise of offering moral support, sat quietly knitting in a corner, her eyes lowered and her ears open. She noticed at once that Euphemia spoke of the supper in great detail, but not of Harold himself. There was pride in the way the woman described her cooking, but not one genuine pang of sorrow at the loss of a seventh husband. The servants were called next. The butler, Mr. Griggs, stood stiff and solemn, insisting that the sherry he poured for Harold was taken from a decanter untouched all week. He claimed he had even sampled it himself and found nothing amiss. The maid, Alice, was less composed. She twisted her apron and confessed in a nervous whisper that she had overheard Euphemia scolding Harold earlier in the week, her voice sharp, her words menacing. "No man tells me what to do," she had said, and Harold, pale and shaken, had answered nothing. The business associates who had joined them at supper, Mr. Lenton and Mr. Graves, were summoned to repeat their accounts. Both were quick to assure the inspector that Harold had seemed unwell, barely touching his food, and that his death must surely have been natural. Their eagerness to dismiss suspicion was almost too ready, and Craddock, who trusted businessmen about as much as he trusted grieving widows, noted their words with a scowl. All the while Miss Marple continued her quiet observations. She noticed that Euphemia never mentioned whether she herself had eaten the pie she claimed to have prepared. She noticed that Griggs's defense of the sherry sounded oddly rehearsed, as if he had been instructed to say it, and she noticed the tremor in Alice's hands which suggested not merely grief but genuine fear. Most striking of all was the way Euphemia seemed to relish the word curse, wearing it like a badge of notoriety rather than a chain of sorrow. When the questioning was done, Craddock admitted grudgingly that conclusions must wait upon the coroner's report. Miss Marple, folding her knitting, murmured that in her experience, when so many funerals arose under the same roof, it was rarely the roof itself that was unlucky. Craddock pressed her for an opinion, but she only smiled, and said she did not accuse, merely observed a pattern. The coroner's report arrived 2 days later. Harold Blackwell had not died of a weak heart, nor from shock or fright, but of digitalis poisoning, the deadly extract of foxglove. The village erupted with fresh gossip. Some said they had seen Euphemia tending her flower beds where foxgloves grew in profusion, their tall purple spires nodding innocently in the breeze. Others whispered that she had been gathering herbs beneath the hedgerows. Euphemia herself responded with dramatic indignation, insisting she was a victim of foul play. Someone jealous of her, someone malicious, must have tampered with Harold's glass to ruin her. Inspector Craddock, unmoved, pressed her again. She admitted she had prepared the meal with her own hands, but protested her innocence, declaring that she was a woman of domestic talents, not a murderess. Miss Marple, with her gentle air, leaned forward and asked in her soft voice whether she had cooked for all her husbands. Euphemia hesitated, just for a moment, before replying that naturally she had. It was not an answer, Miss Marple thought, but a performance, and the truth of performances lay in their pauses. That evening in her own cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting set aside, reflecting on what she had seen. She recalled another case from years before, in a small seaside town where a woman's lovers had all drowned in accidents, each one encouraged to swim after heavy meals. It had been called bad luck until the pattern was recognized for what it was: deliberate design. Human nature was rarely original, Miss Marple reminded herself. Euphemia's story of repeated misfortune was not a curse but a pattern, and patterns in human behavior were rarely innocent. Harold Blackwell had eaten little, had drunk from his glass, and had fallen almost at once. If the poison had not been in the sherry, then it might have been in the pie, and if it were in the pie, then the hand of the cook was plain enough. She took up her diary and made a neat note in her fine slanting hand. Poison reveals the hand of the cook. Observe meals, not motives. Closing the book, she sat back in her chair with the faintest sigh. The village believed Euphemia cursed. Inspector Craddock believed she was guilty, but had yet to prove it. Miss Marple believed something more subtle, that the truth was woven into the habits of the table, into the small, ordinary details that others overlooked. It was not luck that had taken 6 husbands from Euphemia, nor fate that had carried off a seventh before the vows were said. It was something much colder, much more deliberate, and much more dangerous. And until the truth was uncovered, the village would continue to whisper, the inspector would continue to question, and Euphemia Blackwell would continue to play her role as the most unfortunate woman in England. The news of Harold Blackwell's poisoning had spread through St. Mary Mead as quickly as a gust of wind shakes the blossom from an orchard tree. By the time 3 days had passed, every household was repeating some version of the story, embroidered with suspicion and half-believed details. Euphemia Blackwell, for her part, had transformed herself into the picture of tragic dignity, accepting condolences with trembling lips and dramatic sighs, while simultaneously reminding anyone who would listen that she was the victim of cruel fortune. The police might pursue their investigation, but she had already decided upon her narrative. She was blameless, persecuted, and destined to be misunderstood. Inspector Craddock remained unconvinced, though he was careful to keep his skepticism hidden behind official reserve. He had interviewed the widow twice more, each time finding her more polished in her answers, as though she had rehearsed a script. He told Miss Marple in a tone that was both weary and annoyed that he felt like a man shadowboxing with smoke. Everything slid away when he reached for it. Euphemia's alibi was not strong, but it was couched in such melodramatic protestations that to challenge it outright seemed like bullying a grieving woman. Miss Marple listened to him in her quiet parlour, offering tea and seed cake, her blue eyes intent over her knitting. "People do so often play their parts, Inspector," she murmured as if thinking aloud. "And the better the performance, the more likely it is to hide something. You see, grief has a certain rhythm to it. Genuine grief falters in places. It forgets itself. Performed grief is very careful, very deliberate. One notices when tears fall at the wrong moments or when sorrow sounds more like pride." Craddock made a noise of impatience. "You believe she's acting?" "I believe she has practiced the role," Miss Marple said gently. "But the question is, for whose benefit? Yours, or the village's, or her own?" Meanwhile, the coroner's finding of digitalis had forced the inspector to expand his inquiries. He interviewed the chemist in Much Benham, who swore he had not sold foxglove extract to anyone in the district for months. He questioned the gardener at the Blackwell house, who admitted the flower borders were full of foxgloves, but insisted that Euphemia only admired them for their colour. He even paid a visit to Dr. Haydock, the village physician, who admitted that while Euphemia had occasionally feigned ailments, he had never prescribed digitalis for her. Each answer, while innocent on its surface, carried with it an undertone of possibility. If Euphemia had not purchased the poison, perhaps she had prepared it herself. It was not difficult to extract, after all, if one had the knowledge. Miss Marple thought often about the sherry that had been poured and tasted by the butler, found to be harmless, and yet singled out by Euphemia as the detail most worth repeating. It was curious how guilty parties so often attempted to guide suspicion toward the wrong object by mentioning it too frequently. She said nothing of this to the inspector, who was already growing exasperated at the lack of tangible progress, but she carried the observation with her like a seed that would one day bear fruit. She also noted how the maid, Alice, seemed increasingly nervous whenever she came into view. Alice avoided her mistress's gaze and flinched at her sharp tone. Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing servants in all conditions of loyalty and fear, wondered whether Alice knew more than she dared confess. A frightened servant was often a more reliable witness than a bold one. She considered inviting the girl for a quiet talk over tea, knowing that a gentle word in a safe setting could open doors the inspector's stern questioning would never unfasten. On the 4th day after Harold's death, the village was startled by the arrival of a young man who came striding into the inn with a suitcase and a face that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the late Harold. He introduced himself as Arthur Blackwell, nephew to the deceased, and claimed he had business to settle regarding his uncle's estate. His manner was brisk, almost arrogant, and he wasted no time in hinting that Euphemia had been a mistake from the start. He spoke freely in the public room, declaring that his uncle had grown foolish in his later years and had been dazzled by a woman with a reputation for tragedy. His appearance added a new layer of speculation, for villagers now whispered that Perhaps Arthur himself had reason to benefit from Harold's untimely death. Inspector Craddock interviewed him promptly, but Arthur's answers were smooth. He had been in London at the time of the death, supported by witnesses. He seemed content to cast suspicion upon Euphemia, though not without a certain relish that suggested he enjoyed her discomfort. Miss Marple, listening to him in the inn parlour one afternoon, found herself reminded of a spoiled schoolboy who delights in seeing another punished. It did not make him guilty, but it did make him dangerous, for spite could easily tempt a man into mischief if opportunity arose. That same evening, Miss Marple observed Euphemia at church, where she sat in a prominent pew with her veil arranged just so, dabbing at her eyes, while ensuring she was visible to the entire congregation. There was an artistry to her mourning that Miss Marple found more telling than any words. True sorrow sought solitude, Euphemia sought an audience. When the hymns were sung, her voice carried loudly, as though determined to be heard above all others. It was not grief, it was performance. And performance always hinted at concealment. The villagers, divided as ever, grew more entrenched in their opinions. Some declared that Euphemia was a victim of vile rumour and male jealousy, cursed only by fate. Others whispered darkly that 7 men could not all die by chance. Mrs. Price Ridley, shaking her head, declared that she would not be surprised if Euphemia had buried treasure in her garden, and that the husbands had each stumbled too close to discovering it. Miss Hartnell, always eager for a more lurid explanation, announced that she had read in a magazine about a woman who had practiced black magic, and was quite certain Euphemia must be involved in such things. Miss Marple listened to these stories with her usual mild patience, knowing that gossip, though inaccurate in detail, often revealed truths in outline. It showed her the village's mood, its fears, its shifting loyalties. And amid all this, she continued to knit, to listen, and to watch. She noted how Euphemia, whenever confronted with direct suspicion, became not defensive but theatrical. She would lift her chin, declare herself cursed, and scold her accusers with the majesty of a queen wronged. It was not the language of innocence, it was the language of control, as though she believed that by seizing the narrative, she might shape the truth itself. Late one evening, Miss Marple sat by her window and considered the case as she might. A tangled skein of wool. The threads were knotted, but already some patterns emerged. A meal prepared by Euphemia, a man dead of poison, a widow too ready with her speeches, a servant too nervous to speak plainly, and a nephew whose hostility seemed almost as strong as his alibi. Craddock looked for evidence, but Miss Marple looked for behaviour. And behaviour, she reminded herself, rarely lied for long. She resolved that her next step must be to speak gently with Alice, for frightened servants often saw things their masters believed invisible. And she wondered too if Euphemia's hands, so laden with rings, might have revealed in their movements some small but fatal clue when she had spoken of Harold's Last Supper. The evening air was still and heavy, scented with the last roses of summer. The village lay in silence, but Miss Marple knew that silence could be deceiving. Beneath its surface, passions stirred, secrets waited, and truth bided its time. And, if she was not mistaken, the widow's performance would soon falter, and in that falter the shadow of murder would reveal itself. The turn in the investigation came almost by accident, and Inspector Craddock was only too ready to embrace it as a breakthrough. It began with the discovery of a small packet hidden in the servants' quarters at the Blackwell house. The packet contained dried leaves and stems wrapped in brown paper, and when examined by the police surgeon, they were confirmed to be foxglove. It was Alice, the maid, who had been found in possession of them, though her protests rang out the moment the inspector confronted her. She claimed she had never seen the packet before, that it had been planted among her belongings to incriminate her. But Craddock, weary of Euphemia's theatrics and desperate for something concrete, seized upon the find as proof. A servant with access to the kitchen, foxglove hidden in her quarters, and a nervous manner, what could be more suspicious? Euphemia herself seemed astonished when told. She played the scene beautifully, declaring in tones of righteous indignation that she had been betrayed by her own household, that her kindness had been repaid with treachery. Her eyes filled with tears, and she took Alice's denial as a personal affront. "How dare she," Euphemia cried, "accuse me of such a thing when I have kept her clothed and fed? Clearly she sought to profit from my sorrow. Perhaps she thought Harold's death would secure her silence forever. Wicked girl." Alice could do little but weep and insist she was innocent. The villagers, divided before, now leaned heavily against the maid. After all, Euphemia had been elevated by tragedy, while Alice had only fear and trembling to show for herself. Inspector Craddock, though not entirely convinced, felt compelled by the logic of the find. Servants had poisoned masters before. There were precedents enough. He began drafting his report with the possibility of Alice's arrest, and the village settled into a sense of uneasy certainty. Mrs. Price Ridley declared it had been obvious all along that the girl was sly. Miss Hartnell said she had never liked Alice's freckles, and had always suspected her of dishonesty. Even the vicar, kindly soul though he was, admitted that temptation came easily to the young and underpaid. Only Miss Marple remained silent, her knitting needles clicking softly as she listened to the pronouncements around her. She did not join in the chorus of condemnation, nor did she openly defend the girl. She merely observed that the packet had been found with a suspicious neatness, and that Alice's fear seemed less the fear of guilt than the fear of being powerless in the face of accusation. She remembered cases from her past, village squabbles, family disputes, where evidence had been planted by those clever enough to benefit from another's disgrace. A frightened maid was an easy scapegoat. It required only a moment to slip the packet among her belongings, and another moment to reveal it at the proper time. Miss Marple knew the difference between clumsy guilt and orchestrated suspicion. She invited Alice to her cottage one afternoon under the pretense of helping with a bit of mending. The girl arrived pale and red-eyed, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. Over tea and seed cake, Miss Marple spoke to her gently, asking after her health, her family, her years in service. Gradually, Alice unburdened herself, confessing her terror of Euphemia, the sharp words she endured daily, and the sense that her mistress carried a shadow with her wherever she went. "I swear, Miss Marple," Alice whispered, "I never touched. No foxglove, I'd not even know how to use it. But she frightens me, she does. Looks at me like she sees through me, and now they'll say I killed him, when I never so much as harmed a fly." Miss Marple patted her hand and assured her that truth, though often hidden, had a way of surfacing. Inwardly, she was already certain the girl was innocent. The tone of her fear, the sincerity of her tears, reminded Miss Marple of countless young maids she had known over the years, girls too timid to lift a loaf without permission, let alone commit murder. No, Alice was not the culprit. The foxglove had been placed in her quarters by someone cleverer, someone who understood the village's readiness to believe the worst of a servant. The inspector, however, pressed forward. He confronted Alice again, with stern questions, and when she could offer nothing but repeated denials, he took her silence for proof of guilt. Papers were drawn, preparations made, and word spread quickly that an arrest was imminent. Euphemia, draped in black lace, received visitors with the magnanimity of a woman vindicated at last. She accepted their sympathy while lamenting her own cruel fate, speaking as though she were both martyr and heroine. Her triumph was subtle but unmistakable, and yet Miss Marple watched her closely. She noticed how Euphemia avoided looking at Alice directly, as though unwilling to meet the eyes of the scapegoat. She noticed, too, the faint smile that flickered across her lips when villagers muttered that the maid would soon be taken away. It was not the smile of relief, it was the smile of satisfaction. How Euphemia enjoyed her role, not only as the wronged woman, but as the woman whose enemies fell away one by one. The day before Alice was to be formally charged, Miss Marple called upon Inspector Craddock. She found him in his office, surrounded by papers, rubbing his brow with weariness. She asked quietly whether he was certain of the girl's guilt. He admitted he was not. "But what can I do, Miss Marple? We have the evidence. We have motive enough. Resentment, perhaps even theft. She's the only one who could have slipped poison into the food." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Oh no, Inspector. Not the only one. There are always others if one looks past the obvious. It is very convenient, is it not, that the foxglove should appear in the very place most likely to condemn her. Too convenient, I should say. Craddock groaned. You think Euphemia planted it? I think she plays her part too well, Miss Marple replied softly. I have often noticed in my small way that guilty people are rarely silent. They speak too much, they protest too much, they arrange their expressions with great care. Whereas innocence, Inspector, is frightened and tongue-tied. That poor girl has no script, no performance, only fear. Craddock stared at her for a long moment, torn between the neatness of the evidence and the weight of her quiet certainty. He had learned from past experience that Miss Marple's instincts were rarely wrong. Still, he bristled at the lack of proof. Then where does that leave us, he muttered. It leaves us, said Miss Marple calmly, with a puzzle yet unsolved. A puzzle in which someone has taken great care to appear innocent by making another seem guilty. And that, Inspector, is the cleverest trick of all. The following day, Alice was spared arrest, though the reprieve was not made public. Craddock, against his better judgment, allowed the matter to rest for the moment, claiming he required more time. The village, confused, buzzed with fresh rumors. Some said the inspector had lost his nerve. Others claimed Euphemia had bribed him. Euphemia herself, though visibly displeased, could only continue her performance, assuring all who would listen that she had complete faith in justice. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned to her knitting and her quiet garden, her mind working steadily on the knots of the case. She knew the truth would not remain hidden forever. Euphemia had been too bold, too certain of her role, and boldness, Miss Marple reflected, often led to mistakes. It was only a matter of time before one of those mistakes revealed itself, and when it did, the performance would collapse like a stage set struck down at the end of a play. Until then, she would watch and listen and wait, as she always did. For in the theatre of human folly, patience was the detective's greatest weapon. The whispers began not in the Blackwell house, but in the snug of the village inn. Two men, both old enough to remember more than most, sat with their pints and spoke in the half-lowered voices of those who enjoyed being overheard. Euphemia Blackwell's name came up as it often did, and with it came a curious string of recollections. "Seventh husband, they say," one of them remarked, swirling his ale. "Never thought much of it before, but when you count them out, well, it doesn't half make a man wonder." The other nodded sagely. "First one drowned, didn't he? Fell off a pier down in Brighton. The second, consumption. The third, a hunting accident, I think it was. Fourth and fifth, I can't quite recall. The sixth was the banker chap. Heart failure, wasn't it?" A pause followed. Then the man leaned forward, lowering his voice still further. "And now Harold. Strange, isn't it? How death seems to follow her like a faithful dog." Miss Marple did not overhear that particular exchange, but she was treated to the echoes of it the very next morning, when Mrs. Price Ridley came calling under the pretext of returning a borrowed cookbook. She did not even glance at the book, as she placed it primly upon the table. Instead, she leaned close and whispered, "My dear Miss Marple, there is a pattern, do you not see? One death may be tragic, too unfortunate, but 7, it is unnatural. She must be cursed, or worse. Miss..." Marple did not dismiss the suggestion, though she smiled gently as though humouring a flight of fancy. Inwardly, she felt the tremor of recognition. She had always trusted in the patterns of human behaviour, and here at last was a pattern that demanded attention. 7 husbands, each dead before his time. Different causes, different places, yet the same woman at the centre of it all. Fate, perhaps? But Miss Marple had never been one to lean heavily upon fate. Men and women shaped their own destinies far more often than they realized, and sometimes they shaped them for others as well. The widow's past was seldom spoken of openly in the village. Euphemia had cultivated an air of mystery about her earlier marriages, offering vague recollections when pressed, dismissing questions with a sorrowful sigh or a coy smile. But Miss Marple, with her sharp memory and long acquaintance with the ways of the world, began quietly piecing together what little she knew. There had been money in the first marriage, a small inheritance that allowed Euphemia to travel. The second husband had been ill for years before their union, a fact that Euphemia had glossed over when recounting her youthful devotion. The third had been robust until the hunting accident that left him crushed beneath his horse. And so it went. Miss Marple saw in these fragments not fate, but calculation. Each husband, she noted, had provided Euphemia with some advantage: wealth, property, social standing, or freedom. None had lasted long enough to grow suspicious, nor had any left behind family eager to question their demise. It was as though Euphemia had stepped lightly from one stepping stone to the next, always advancing, never slipping, while those beneath her vanished into the water. Inspector Craddock, for his part, grew increasingly frustrated. He had suspended action against Alice, but that only left him without a culprit. He could not, as he confided to Miss Marple one afternoon, go about arresting a woman on account of her marital history. The coroner had confirmed that foxglove was the poison, yes, but no bottle, no tincture, no residue had been found in the kitchen or larder. Without evidence, without witness, the case hung limp. Miss Marple listened, nodded, and said nothing. Of her suspicions, she preferred to wait. She knew, as gardeners know the soil, that truth germinates in its own time. What she did notice, however, was Euphemia's increasing restlessness. The widow began to appear in public more often, as though determined to keep the village firmly in her thrall. She attended the vicar's tea, where she wept openly about her cruel fate, then laughed too brightly at a joke moments later. She visited the grocer and handled every apple before choosing one. She swept into the post office with black gloves and a veil, speaking loudly enough for all to hear. It was not grief that motivated her, it was performance. And a woman who performs so tirelessly, Miss Marple reflected, often betrays herself in the end. The turning point came one damp evening when Miss Marple, seated by her window with her knitting, noticed Euphemia walking quickly up the lane. She was alone, dressed not in mourning black but in a dark green cloak that caught the lamplight strangely. In her hand she carried a small basket. Miss Marple watched as the widow paused at the hedge, glanced around, and slipped something from the basket into the ditch. It was too dark to see what, but the gesture was furtive, deliberate. Miss Marple's needles stilled in her lap. It was the sort of moment she had trained herself never to overlook. The next morning, after the widow had departed for a visit to the vicarage, Miss Marple strolled up the lane with her basket on her arm, as though in search of blackberries. She paused at the very spot where Euphemia had stopped and peered into the ditch. There, among the damp leaves, lay a small bottle, its label worn but still faintly legible. She did not touch it herself. Instead, she fetched young Tommy from the grocer's and asked him to carry it carefully to Inspector Craddock. The inspector examined the bottle that same afternoon. The remnants inside tested positive for digitalis, the active toxin of foxglove. It was the first tangible piece of evidence to emerge, though its chain of custody was far from ideal. Craddock, though uneasy, admitted to Miss Marple that the discovery smelled of Euphemia. And yet, as always, she had her explanations ready. When confronted, she laughed lightly, declaring that the bottle must have belonged to Harold. He was always taking tonics, poor dear, she said, eyes bright with false innocence. I dare say he threw it away himself. You know how careless men can be. But Miss Marple saw something else in Euphemia's performance that day. A flicker of irritation, quickly smoothed into charm. It was not the irritation of a falsely accused woman, it was the irritation of a player whose stagecraft had been disrupted. Miss Marple noted it, stored it away, and continued her knitting. That evening, as she sat alone, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought of other women she had known, widows who lived quietly on their pensions, wives who buried husbands with genuine sorrow. Euphemia was not like them. She was not content to live quietly. She thrived on drama, on spectacle, on being the center of every conversation. 7 husbands had died, each one leaving her richer, freer, more formidable. And now Harold. Was it possible, Miss Marple wondered, that she had grown careless at last? That in pursuing her familiar pattern, once more, she had left a thread hanging loose, waiting to be tugged? If so, Miss Marple intended to be the one to tug it, for she had learned long ago that human beings were never truly original in their sins. They repeated themselves over and over until someone at last noticed the rhythm. Euphemia's rhythm was death, and Miss Marple had begun to hear the beat. The reprieve for Alice should have steadied the village, but instead it unsettled it more. When suspicion does not settle upon one head, it drifts restlessly until it finds another. And in St. Mary Mead, there was no shortage of tongues eager to direct it. Euphemia Blackwell, far from retreating into mourning, began to haunt the lanes and shops of the village with renewed vigor. Always in black lace, always with her veil half lifted, she told her tale in 100 variations. How cruelly she had been bereaved, how narrowly she had escaped poisoning herself, how her household was infested with treachery. Each version grew richer in detail, like an actress improving a part with each performance. It was during one such performance at the grocer's that the second incident occurred. Euphemia was selecting apples, turning them over in her hands, when suddenly she gave a sharp cry and dropped one to the floor. "My fingers," she exclaimed dramatically. "They tingle, they burn. I've been poisoned again." The grocer's boy looked alarmed. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had been standing nearby, nearly dropped her basket of tea biscuits. Euphemia pressed her handkerchief to her lips, declared she felt faint, and allowed herself to be carried to a chair. Within minutes, half the high street knew the widow had suffered another attempt on her life. The doctor, called in haste, could find no trace of harm. Her pulse was steady, her skin unblemished. He suggested gently that perhaps the apple had been sprayed with something disagreeable in storage. Euphemia dismissed him with a tragic sigh. "You may trust your science, Dr. Leonard, but I trust what I feel. Someone seeks my life." Miss Marple, who had observed the scene from the far end of the shop, knitted quietly on her way home and said nothing. But inwardly she reflected that Euphemia's hand had looked perfectly normal when she held it aloft, and that the widow had seized the moment just as Mrs. Price Ridley bent down to examine the apples. A clever dramatist always chooses the largest audience. By the next morning the story had doubled in size. Euphemia had been poisoned through her very skin, the gossip declared, and if not for her fortitude, she might have perished on the grocer's floor. Alice, already shrinking from the suspicion of the first supposed attempt, was once again the village scapegoat. Several people swore they had seen her loitering near the shop earlier, though no two accounts agreed on the time. Inspector Craddock, weary of Euphemia's theatrics yet bound to investigate, sent for Alice again. The girl, white-faced and trembling, insisted she had never been near the apples. She burst into tears, declaring she wished to leave the village forever. Craddock sighed and dismissed her, but the pressure mounted. The villagers wanted a culprit, and Alice was convenient. That evening Miss Marple invited Inspector Craddock to her cottage for tea. She poured with her usual gentleness, offered seed cake, and listened while he spoke in exasperation. "It is like chasing shadows, Miss Marple. First the tea, now the apples. Each time there is no proof, no substance. If Euphemia is not in earnest, then she is the greatest actress in England. And if she is in earnest, then we have a poisoner more cunning than I've ever known." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "People who like to be admired, Inspector, do not always choose the most respectable means of achieving. Kate, I have noticed in my small way that there are those who will fall ill merely to secure attention, and others who will imagine injuries in order to be pitied. It is not unusual, but when such a person also has a history, 7 husbands. For instance, one must look more carefully. Human nature, you know, does not change so very much." Craddock rubbed his brow. "You believe she's staging these incidents?" "I think it possible. Indeed, I think it very likely. It provides her with 2 advantages: sympathy from those who might doubt her, and further suspicion cast upon that poor girl Alice. It is most convenient, too convenient perhaps." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes rested on her knitting, but her mind moved far beyond it. She thought of Euphemia's theatrical feint in the shop, her dramatic flourish at the grocer's. The woman was weaving a tapestry, and each thread was designed to entangle someone else. But all performances, Miss Marple knew, contain a flaw, an overlooked detail that rings false to the careful observer. The next day, Euphemia invited several ladies to luncheon at her house. Miss Marple, to her surprise, received an invitation as well. She accepted with quiet interest. The widow greeted her guests in a gown of purple silk, her veil lifted just enough to show her artful pallor. The table was set with gleaming silver and fine china, the food plentiful. Euphemia played hostess with exaggerated sweetness, pressing second helpings upon her guests, recounting stories of Harold with mournful eyes. It was not until dessert that the performance took its final turn. Euphemia lifted a spoonful of custard, tasted it, and gave a piercing cry. "Bitter! Poisoned!" She dropped the spoon, clutched at her throat, and collapsed against her chair. The room erupted in confusion. One of the ladies shrieked, another pushed her own dish away with trembling hands. Miss Marple alone continued eating calmly, spooning the custard with delicate precision. It tasted of nothing more sinister than eggs and sugar. Dr. Leonard was summoned once more. He found Euphemia reviving rapidly under the attention of her guests, her cheeks flushed, her pulse perfectly sound. He examined the custard and declared it harmless. Euphemia, however, insisted she had tasted the bitterness of death upon her tongue. Inspector Craddock, who arrived shortly after, was less indulgent. "This is becoming intolerable, Mrs. Blackwell," he said bluntly. 3 attempts in a fortnight, and not a scrap of evidence in any of them. I begin to wonder whether the danger lies not in your kitchen, but in your imagination. Euphemia drew herself up with dignity. "If you cannot protect me, Inspector, then I shall protect myself. But let the record show that I am pursued by a relentless enemy." Miss Marple watched the scene with her usual serenity. She noted the way Euphemia glanced slyly at her guests, measuring their fear. She saw the flicker of irritation cross the widow's face when Miss Marple alone ate her custard without hesitation. It was a fleeting expression, quickly masked, but it told her all she needed to know. Euphemia had not intended Miss Marple to resist the performance. She had not counted upon someone quietly puncturing the drama with a calm spoonful of custard. That evening Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, knitting in the soft lamplight. She reviewed what she had seen. A woman who built her life upon performance, who thrived upon suspicion and sympathy, who had buried 7 husbands without ever shedding a convincing tear. Now Euphemia turned her skills upon the village itself, weaving a story in which she was both victim and survivor. But performances, Miss Marple reflected, were exhausting things. They required ever greater flourishes, ever larger audiences. And eventually, even the cleverest actress must stumble over her lines. The trick, Miss Marple told herself, was to be watching closely when she did. The luncheon had unsettled even the most steadfast of Euphemia's supporters. Though she told the story afterward with tears and trembling hands, there was a faint discord in her notes. Mrs. Price Ridley, though still inclined to be sympathetic, confessed to Miss Hartnell in the post office that she couldn't help noticing how, very quickly, Euphemia had recovered from her ordeal. Miss Hartnell, who prided herself on her forthrightness, went further. "If she was poisoned," she declared, "then I'm the Queen of Sheba." Gossip, that most unerring of village barometers, had begun to turn. Euphemia, of course, sensed it at once. Like an actress whose audience no longer applauds at the right moments, she grew restless. Her stories became more elaborate, her tones more indignant. She hinted darkly at shadowy enemies, at old scandals revived, at jealous women who could not endure her dignity. But the more she protested, the more uncertain her listeners became. One could pity a widow forever pursued by tragedy. It was harder to believe in one who seemed to court it. Miss Marple observed all this with her usual quietness. She said little, merely went about her errands, knitting in her lap, her eyes ever watchful. But in her mind a plan began to form. Euphemia thrived on performance. Very well. Then perhaps it was time to give her a stage, one that would reveal her true nature without her even realizing it. The opportunity presented itself at the vicarage. The vicar, troubled by the divisions in his flock, had suggested a small gathering to restore a sense of fellowship. Nothing formal, merely tea and hymn-singing in the garden, weather permitting. Euphemia, naturally, volunteered to attend, insisting that her shattered nerves required the comfort of community. Miss Marple, with the gentlest of nudges, encouraged the plan, suggesting that the widow's presence would reassure the village. The vicar, relieved, agreed. On the afternoon in question, the garden filled with the usual assortment of villagers. Mrs. Price Ridley arrived first, with her hat pinned so tightly that no breeze could have disturbed it. Miss Hartnell came with her dog in tow, though it was not strictly invited. Alice, pale but determined, hovered near the gate as if fearful of both entering and staying away. Euphemia swept in last, resplendent in mourning silk, a figure of tragic grandeur. Miss Marple placed herself unobtrusively at the tea table. She poured cups, offered seed cake, listened to chatter. When the moment seemed right, she leaned toward Euphemia and said in her mild conversational way, "You must be so very tired, dear, of these dreadful attempts. It quite puts one in mind of poor Mr. Latimer, who was so sure someone was trying to poison him, when in fact it was only his own fondness for green apples." Several heads turned at once. Euphemia, caught off guard, blinked. "Mr. Latimer?" she repeated. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking gently. "Yes, indeed, a most dramatic case. He insisted upon danger at every turn, thought his tea had been tampered with, swore someone had laced his port. All the while it was merely his own bad digestion. So tragic, really, that he should have imagined enemies where none existed. It ruined his reputation entirely. People grew suspicious of him." She let the words hang delicately in the air, as if by accident. The effect upon Euphemia was immediate. Her face flushed beneath the veil, her lips tightened. "Are you suggesting, Miss Marple," she demanded, "that I am imagining things?" "Oh, no, my dear," Miss Marple said serenely, "not suggesting at all. Only observing that human nature is very curious. One sees such patterns in villages, you know, and patterns once noticed are very difficult to forget." Around them the villagers shifted uneasily. Euphemia's composure wavered. For the first time, she looked not like the dignified widow, but like a woman cornered. She laughed, too sharply, too loudly. "Well, if you think me mad, perhaps I should withdraw from society altogether." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied gently. "But one must be careful, mustn't one, that people do not come to believe one's misfortunes are self-inflicted." It was a small exchange, nothing more, but it set tongues wagging for days. Euphemia, furious, tried to reassert her role, but doubt had crept in. People began to look at her differently. When she passed in the street, whispers followed. When she entered the grocer's, the boy no longer sprang to attention, but watched her warily. Even Mrs. Price Ridley, once her staunchest defender, admitted privately that there was something not quite right about the whole business. Inspector Craddock, who had attended the vicar's gathering at Miss Marple's invitation, later confessed himself astonished. "You managed to rattle her without accusing her of a thing," he said. "Oh, I would never accuse," Miss Marple answered mildly. "That is the inspector's duty. But sometimes one may place a mirror in a person's hand and let them see her themselves. It is surprising how often they flinch." Still, Euphemia was not one to yield easily. If the village began to doubt her innocence, she would find new ways to command the stage. And so she did. That very week, she appeared at church in widow's weeds, more extravagant than ever, carrying a black-bound prayer book and weeping loudly through the hymns. She called at the vicarage 3 times, speaking of her loneliness. She invited the ladies of the parish to tea and insisted they accompany her, for safety, for she feared to be alone. Miss Marple accepted one such invitation. She watched closely as Euphemia poured the tea, noting the way her hands lingered on the cups, the way her eyes flickered to see who drank and who did not. The widow was performing again, and every gesture was calculated. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her expression mild, but inwardly she felt the net drawing tighter. Euphemia was clever, yes, but cleverness always betrayed itself in the end. That night, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple considered the puzzle. She thought of 7 husbands, each dead. She thought of Alice, frightened and blameless. She thought of the villagers, so eager to believe in curses and villains, and she thought of Euphemia, forever on her stage, forever delivering her lines. The widow had grown careless. She had repeated her patterns too often, woven her dramas too tightly. It was only a matter of time before she tripped over her own script. And when she did, Miss Marple intended to be there. Quiet, knitting, apparently. Inattentive, ready to catch the truth as it slipped from her lips. The shift in village sentiment was now unmistakable. Once Euphemia Blackwell had been admired, if not exactly loved, for her elegance, her tragic history, and her indomitable poise. But now the admiration had soured. People nodded politely in the lane, but no longer stopped for conversation. Invitations dwindled. Even Mrs. Price Ridley, who had defended her so stoutly, found herself faltering under the weight of whispered doubts. Euphemia, never one to yield without a struggle, began to grow desperate. She appeared in public more often, dressed to perfection, determined to command attention. She spoke in louder tones, told stories of her grief more elaborately. But the effect was not what she intended. Instead of inspiring sympathy, it seemed to confirm suspicions. Her life had become a stage play, and the audience no longer believed in the performance. Miss Marple, sitting quietly with her knitting, watched this gradual unraveling. She had by now fitted together many pieces of the puzzle. Euphemia's pattern was clear to her. The repeated performances of grief, the rehearsed indignation, the subtle manipulation of public opinion. But there remained one final test. For, if Euphemia was indeed guilty, she would reveal it not in her words, but in her reactions when faced with the unexpected. Human nature, Miss Marple always said, was the truest evidence of all. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Inspector Craddock, weary of speculation and frustrated by lack of proof, suggested one final interview with Euphemia. If she's innocent, she will withstand the questioning. If not, well, perhaps we'll see a crack in the armor. Miss Marple proposed a small adjustment. Perhaps, she said gently, we might arrange matters so that Mrs. Blackwell feels she is in control. People like Euphemia, you know, often betray themselves when they believe they have the upper hand. And so a plan was formed. Euphemia was invited to tea at the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss a charitable bequest Harold had once mentioned. She arrived, of course, in full mourning attire, her veil lowered, her gloves immaculate. She greeted the vicar with gracious sorrow, spoke piously of her late husband's wishes, and accepted a cup of tea with trembling hands. It was then that Miss Marple, sitting unobtrusively in the corner with her knitting, spoke in her gentle, meandering way. "Such a pity," she murmured, "that Harold's nephew could not be here. He was so very fond of his uncle. I imagine he must feel the loss dreadfully." Euphemia stiffened, only for a moment, but Miss Marple did not miss. "Dearest nephew," she repeated, her tone sharper than she intended. "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said innocently, her needles clicking. "A very nice young man. Quite devoted, I thought. He was seen about the village just before Harold's unfortunate collapse. It was odd that he left so suddenly. People do notice such things, you know." The widow recovered quickly. She laughed, too, brightly. "Oh, that boy, hardly worth mentioning. He was a fortune hunter, I assure you. He knew Harold would never leave him a penny." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, "but one does not always know the contents of a will. Sometimes the dead surprise us." It was then that Euphemia faltered. Her teacup rattled against its saucer and she bit her lip. The vicar, fumbling with a plate of biscuits, pretended not to notice. Inspector Craddock, seated at the far end of the table, leaned forward ever so slightly. The silence lengthened. Euphemia, realizing too late that she had betrayed a flicker of fear, forced another laugh and changed the subject, but the damage was done. For Miss Marple, it was all the confirmation she required. Euphemia knew too much. Her certainty that Harold's nephew had been disinherited could only come from intimate knowledge. Knowledge she could not have possessed unless she had seen the will or influenced it before Harold's death. That evening, as Euphemia swept out of the vicarage in her silks and mourning veil, Miss Marple remained behind with Inspector Craddock. "You see, Inspector," she said mildly, "the lady has played her part too often. She is accustomed to her audience believing her, but the trick is rather spoiled once one has seen it before. She overreached herself. She betrayed that she knows the contents of a will not yet made public. That is not accident. It is foreknowledge, and foreknowledge in such a case is very incriminating." Craddock rubbed his chin. You believe she poisoned him then? Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. I believe she prepared the stage, yes. Poison is her weapon, as it so often is in such cases. Not the dramatic poisons of fiction, but the quiet, cumulative kind. Something slipped into a glass, unnoticed, producing symptoms that could be mistaken for heart failure. Harold Blackwell never stood a chance, and neither, I think, did any of the 6 who came before him. The inspector frowned. But how can we prove it? Without evidence? Evidence, Miss Marple interrupted gently, is often a matter of perception. One cannot always prove the facts, but one can reveal the truth. And truth, Inspector, has a curious way of making itself undeniable. Craddock regarded her with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. So what do you suggest, Miss Marple? She smiled faintly. Oh, nothing so very clever, only that we provide Euphemia with the role she most desires, an audience, and then we allow her to speak just a little too freely. The inspector agreed, though somewhat reluctantly. It was unorthodox, perhaps even risky. But Miss Marple had never been wrong before, and he had learned that her instincts were worth a dozen police reports. The next days passed with the village in a fever of speculation. Euphemia, sensing her control slipping further, redoubled her efforts. She staged scenes of grief in the churchyard, burst into tears at the grocer's, and told anyone who would listen that she was being persecuted. But behind the scenes, Miss Marple and the inspector were preparing the final act. It would take place at the vicarage once more, with a gathering of villagers under the pretense of discussing a memorial for Harold. Euphemia naturally would attend. She could not resist such an occasion. One more stage, one more audience to win back. And there Miss Marple intended to watch her closely, to pose one final, gentle question that Euphemia could not answer without betraying herself. The widow, who had cooked her 7th husband's last supper, was nearing the end of her performance. All that remained was the final curtain. The vicarage garden, that peaceful refuge of roses and hymn books, had never held such quiet tension. The late afternoon sun slanted across the lawn, glinting on the polished silver teapot, the plates of sponge cake and scones laid carefully upon the long table. To the casual eye, it was an ordinary parish gathering, Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Hartnell whispering together, Alice pale and watchful at the edge of the crowd, the vicar bustling to and fro, ensuring no one lacked for tea. But to those who knew better, Miss Marple sitting unobtrusively with her knitting, and Inspector Craddock pacing like a man waiting for a train, it was a stage set for a final act. Euphemia Blackwell arrived with the grandeur of a tragedienne. She wore black silk, veiled in chiffon, her jewels catching the light as if in defiance of grief. She greeted each villager with tragic dignity, clasped hands, spoke of Harold's virtues with rehearsed sorrow. She was magnificent, and she knew it. But her audience, once enthralled, now seemed uneasy. The whispers of suspicion had spread too far. The vicar cleared his throat. "We are gathered," he said solemnly, "to consider what memorial might be most fitting for Harold Blackwell. He was in many respects a generous man," Euphemia interrupted with a theatrical sob. "So generous, so noble, so cruelly snatched away. I can scarcely believe it still." Miss Hartnell muttered to Mrs. Price Ridley, "She believes it well enough when she's planning the flowers." The vicar, flustered, pressed on. He spoke of memorials and donations, but Miss Marple waited. Her hands were steady, her needles clicking softly. She knew the moment would come, and when it did, it must be seized with precision. At last, when the conversation lulled, she looked up with her mild smile. "I suppose," she said softly, "it will depend on Harold's wishes. He must have left some instructions. After all, his will would tell us what he truly desired." There was a silence, sudden and sharp, as though the garden itself held its breath. Euphemia stiffened. Inspector Craddock spoke, his voice deceptively casual. "Indeed. The will is a curious document. One would expect it to leave everything to his new wife, and yet—" He let the words trail away. Euphemia leaned forward, eyes glittering behind her veil. "And yet," Craddock looked at her steadily, "and yet it seems Harold left a considerable portion to his nephew. Rather a surprise, that. It was a bluff. The will had not yet been fully read. Its details remained private. But Euphemia did not know that. She drew herself up, lips curling. Impossible. The boy was cut off entirely. Harold told me so himself. The gasp that followed was almost theatrical in its own right. Mrs. Price Ridley clutched Miss Hartnell's arm. The vicar dropped a plate of scones. Alice stared, wide-eyed, as though she had seen the devil himself step from the shrubbery. Missy Marple's needles paused. Her expression was one of gentle surprise. "How very curious, dear," she said softly. "For the contents of a will are not usually discussed, except with the lawyer, of course. And the will, as the inspector says, has not yet been read." Euphemia froze. For the first time her composure faltered. She looked from face to face, saw suspicion crystallize into certainty. She stammered, attempted a laugh, but it rang hollow. In the quiet garden. "You see," Miss Marple continued, her tone kindly, almost sorrowful, "it is rather like those little patterns one notices in village life. A woman so very often widowed, so very ready with her stories of grief, so very sure of details she ought not to know. It puts one in mind of those unfortunate cases where the lady's hand is perhaps a trifle too eager in preparing the evening glass. One cannot help but wonder, you see, if poor Harold's supper was not so very different from the 6 before. Him! There was a murmur among the villagers, like the rustling of leaves in a sudden wind. Euphemia's eyes flashed. "Are you accusing me, Miss Marple?" she demanded, her voice sharp with fury. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her tone as gentle as ever. "Oh no, my dear, I accuse no one, I merely observe. But perhaps you will explain how you came to know the contents of Harold's will before anyone else had seen it." Euphemia faltered. She opened her mouth, closed it again. The silence pressed down like a weight. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his voice firm now, no longer casual. "Mrs. Blackwell, I think we had better continue this conversation in private. You will accompany me, please." It was not yet a formal arrest, but the look on Euphemia's face told the story. Her performance was over. The mask had slipped, and beneath it lay not the grieving widow but the calculating woman who had outlived 7 men. She rose, trembling with rage, and allowed herself to be led away. The villagers watched in silence, a silence that said more than any words could. When they were gone, the garden seemed suddenly lighter, as though a storm had passed. Mrs. Price Ridley exhaled loudly. "Well," she said, "I always said there was something odd about her." Miss Hartnell sniffed. "I knew it from the first. 7 husbands. No woman needs that many." The vicar shook his head sadly. "We must remember," he said, "that she is still a soul in need of prayer." But Miss Marple, folding her knitting neatly into her bag, spoke only once more. "It is a curious thing, human nature. One may perform grief 1,000 times, but it is very difficult to perform innocence. That, I fear, cannot be rehearsed." And with that she rose and made her way home through the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, her step unhurried, her thoughts as calm as the summer evening. Another puzzle had been resolved, another tragedy laid bare. The widow who cooked her 7th husband's last supper would cook no more.